welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell, and we are here today with a local person who has had a lot to do with many different associations, especially in the nature world. Roger Haydock has been involved in the Bonneville Environmental Education Center. He was one of the early supporters, and he was on the board at the time. He's also still very involved in the Windmill Hill, Pinnacle, and the Putney Mountain Associations. Many people have enjoyed Roger's animated, informative, and totally fun nature walks, where he takes people out into the wilds of our area and tells them all kinds of fabulous things. Also, by the way, Roger has traveled the world and had many adventures and has amazing stories in his 40-year career in the documentary film business. So we're here with Roger. Roger, thanks for coming on today.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Yes, it's great to see you. So, Roger, you were a city kid. Mainly, right?
I grew up around Boston, but I was fortunate that right where I lived, there was woods around our house. There was a cliff, there was ponds. And so I was playing out in the woods all the time as a child. I just adored the woods. I knew all the names of the trees. I still can remember every square inch of the landscape around our family's place. And that love of nature has been with me throughout my life. And so ultimately it brought me up here. I went to school in Boston, then I went to a boarding school, and boarding school is a pretty intense experience, and the most intense experience I had was in my senior year. I was fortunate to have a series of spiritual revelatory experiences, which really took me out of the world that I'd been conditioned to be in, which was thought to be, very accomplishment-oriented and achievement-centric. And among the realizations that came to me spontaneously was that my life's mission should be to learn rather than to be taught. And that therefore, much to the consternation of my parents, I decided not to go to college.
Wow.
And so I graduated from prep school in 1968. The summer of '68, I hitchhiked out to Chicago, protested against the National Convention, the Democratic National Convention, got thrown in jail. Then the following winter, I came up here. My grandfather in the 30s had bought a farm up here. And my family would come in the summers, and I'd always loved it up here. And so I skied that winter of '68, '69, which I just loved doing. And then, looking for things to do, I started working as a volunteer at the WGBH auction down in Boston, and I was picking up materials for them to auction off on their fundraiser. And when that was over, I managed to get a paid crew on a paid job on their studio crew. When that was over, I started working freelance as a camera assistant, the lowliest position on a crew in their film department. I was 19 years old. I had no idea what I'd gotten myself into, but I'd hit the jackpot. This was the most interesting job you could ever have. The very first series of films I worked on was a PBS show to be shown to like 10 and 12-year-olds about inner city children playing. And so we went to all of these neighborhoods in the inner cities of Boston and New York and Philadelphia, New Orleans, or in some of the rural areas, and filmed these kids and saw how the kids would look at a vacant lot, but to them it was this magic world, forts and castles and all of that. Then I decided, hey, I don't think I need to go to college. I'm going to keep doing this. And so by 1971, I was working on a lot of programs, also for the BBC. I was freelance. And in 1971, I remember we interviewed Daniel Ellsberg. Oh, wow. Yes, right after the Pentagon Papers had come out in a fourth floor walk-up apartment in Cambridge. The next year, again in another freelance job, we interviewed Ben Bradley. Oh, wow. So if anyone's seen that movie, The Post, I mean, I'd interviewed a lot of these people right at that time.
Did you have any idea, Roger, at the time that you were doing these interviews, what a big deal it was and how much was really going on and what it meant?
Well, I think I didn't fully understand all of the implications of the Pentagon Papers.
Like none of us did,
Right, it was a big story, but and but with distance of time,
Yes.
you can see, yeah, wow, this was really quite something.
You're on the ground floor.
Ground floor.
Yeah.
And I got to be a fly on the wall in all these most interesting places. Then along comes 1973, WGBH decides it's going to make an American version of the British science show called Horizon and call it Nova. So I worked on the very first Nova that was done in this country called Where Did the Colorado River Go? And then ultimately I, over many years, worked on a grand total of 60 Nova episodes or Horizon episodes. And so I paid a lot of attention and got, you know, an incredible education. There were 4 people who armed the original atom bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. I worked on hour-long films with 3 of the 4.
Oh my God.
And one of them, I think is maybe the most interesting, was a physicist named Louis Alvarez. And he was one of those physicists in the 30s and 40s who made the breakthrough discoveries of nuclear physics. And he helped arm the atom bomb. After the war, he became a physics professor at Berkeley. In 1968, he won the Nobel Prize in physics. Then he retired, and Berkeley gave him an office because he'd won the Nobel Prize even though he was retired, and he was working on projects about gamma rays and things like that. And his son, Walter, was a geology professor at Berkeley, and his son, Walter, went to Louis, the dad, and said, Dad, everywhere we look in the world, where there's dinosaur age rocks below and mammal age rocks above, because remember the dinosaurs went extinct and so they stopped being deposited and then the mammals took over. Everywhere we look, there's this dark layer of something. We see it in New Zealand, we see it in Italy, we see it in Texas. What's going on? So they look at it, they examine it, and they see that it's got an element called iridium in it. And iridium comes either from meteors or from volcanic eruptions. And so they start putting out hypotheses, and the one that fits is a meteor hit the Earth, okay? Kicked up huge amounts of material, killed off the dinosaurs, and they proposed this around 1979, 79, 80. And so I was privileged to work on a Nova that was about that exact subject.
That's incredible.
And it was really amazing, you know, and just what an amazing scientist Louis Alvarez was to have done this. And what a privilege it was to be a fly on the wall.
So for you, you're what, 23, 24
well,
at this point?
I was around 29 or 30 because I was born in 1950.
But yeah, your education was vast. Just
vast.
With Nova.
I got the best education you could ever have. And then I'm very curious, intellectually curious person, so I've been all along educating myself from reading in addition to working on all these programs. And so the range of my self-education is enormous because my curiosity is enormous, and it's much helped by working on all these programs. Another film I worked on, say around 1980, maybe 81, was Ken Burns has recently done a film about Vietnam, which is mostly first-person memories and that kind of thing. We interviewed, for this other PBS series, the principals, the people who made the decisions, at least those who were still alive. So I got to be a fly on the wall in Dean Rusk's office, Dean Rusk being the Secretary of State during that period. Dean Rusk saying in 1980, we were right to be in Vietnam. If we hadn't stopped them in Vietnam, they would have been at Santa Monica virtually. I mean, he didn't quite say that. Okay, so he's saying that. We interviewed General Westmoreland, and off camera, he came fairly close to saying we shouldn't have been there. He wouldn't say it on camera, and he wouldn't exactly say it, but he was giving a different view. We interviewed Clark Clifford, who was the man who persuaded Lyndon Johnson to stop escalating. He called Vietnam an honest mistake. We interviewed in West Palm Beach somebody who'd been very high up in the South Vietnamese regime, and I can't remember which one it was, but he lived in West Palm Beach now. What was he doing as of the early 80s? Running a Vietnamese restaurant. So he'd come down, and then we interviewed an aide to Johnson named Harry McPherson, who was a young aide, kind of like Bill Moyers was at that time. And Harry McPherson would go to Johnson, Johnson would say, we've really got to win this war. This is absolutely critical to win it. We've got to stop the communists here. And Harry McPherson would come away from this conversation and go to another aide and say, I think Johnson really supports the war. And the other aide would say, well, I just spoke to Johnson, and he told me he thinks this war is the biggest mistake we ever made, right? So his own aides did not know whether Johnson supported the war or not. Johnson was this tormented man. And in 1972, I lived in Boston, and I saw that Speaker of the House McCormick's wife had died, and that there was a memorial service in South Boston. So I took the subway down. It was a gray day, a gray winter day. And I just stood outside that church, and who was standing on the sidewalk but Lyndon Johnson, this tall, gaunt, ghostly figure. His skin was white. He had only months to live. He was a ruined, haunted man. This man who had brought more good in terms of racial equality than anybody since Abraham Lincoln, who had done so much for this country, but who had also ripped it apart with this awful war. And to see this haunted, gaunt figure, wow.
Conflicted.
Conflicted,
yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Just the fact that all of his aides said something different about the way he felt about things. Yeah, that must have been quite,
it was
that
really,
in itself was just such a snapshot of that whole time.
Yeah. So I worked for all the networks ultimately, a great deal for the BBC. One independent production I worked for that was a PBS science series was one in the early 80s where, again, it was a children's program to be shown in schools. And I think we did 13 episodes, and the storyline was that this 11-year-old child lived in Iowa, and in the summers his parents sent him east to Maine to go sailing with his grandfather in a schooner. And they were going to sail around, and various scientists would be on board, and they do
that's
science.
Cool, yeah.
So they did, depth readings of temperatures and things like that, and then there was a storm where the boat, was rocking back and forth, and the crew all got seasick. I mean, that was the end. We ended filming when everybody was prone. That was the end of that day. But anyway, and so the boat washes up on a desert island, and they have to make it solar still. The star of this movie was an 11-year-old kid. He was very personable, very bright, and those of us on this production said, you watch, this kid's gonna go somewhere.
Yes,
and what was his name? Ben Affleck.
That's so great.
Our Ben, we call him now.
I'll bet you do.
And we watched him, and for the first 20 years he wasn't famous, and then he hit the big time.
That's pretty cool.
It's really neat.
Also the fact that you recognized that he had it at that age.
It was very clear. You could see it. It was unmistakable. Another interesting film I worked on was for ABC Sports in the 1980 Winter Olympics. And I was, again, a camera assistant, and the high point of, it was very interesting all over, but the high point was to be in the arena when the Americans beat the Russians. This team of American college kids.
This is hockey?
Hockey.
Hockey, yeah.
Yes, beat the best team in the world, the Russian Army team. And the emotion inside that auditorium is the most intense thing I've ever seen. This was after America had felt humiliated in Vietnam, after the Russians had invaded Afghanistan, so they were portrayed as sort of like the villains.
Yes.
And the country's self-image, this country's self-image was sort of in the dumps, right? But here was this team where our guys were beating the Russians, and the auditorium was surging with so much emotion. The air was vibrating, the whole place was shaking. I mean, the auditorium felt like it was going to shake down or something.
Wow.
People had huge flags that they were waving from the balcony. I have never experienced anything that intense.
Wow.
And you can see that surge of A, patriotism, but B, coming back from humiliation.
Right.
Because, and you can see that in the wrong hands, an Adolf Hitler could turn that into something that could devastate
that kind
the world.
Of crowd fervor, yes.
Yes, and so I experienced that.
Wow.
In addition to which, I also worked on the ABC Winter Olympics as the assistant to the cameraman who would run down the downhill course with the camera handheld. So just before the race, he'd go down, Down he'd go. Then one by one, all the racers would go at their intervals. And when the race was finally over, who came down the track next? It was me, with a knapsack of film equipment on my back, just snow plowing down as the crowd laughed and clapped.
That's great. What a moment.
I know, it was
What
my
a moment.
you know.
You were at the 80 Olympics, right?
That was it. They didn't give me a gold medal, though.
That's a great story.
Yes.
You were at PBS doing Nova until 96.
96, right, from 73 to 96. I mean, freelance, and
Freelancing,
just didn't
right.
work on every single program, but worked on a lot of them. That's, and I paid attention.
Yeah.
And what was really great is at lunch you could ask all the scientists.
Oh, that's so cool.
Your questions,
Yeah.
you know, and also you were getting them giving their absolute best presentation each time when they were on the air. You knew. So as I said to the executive producer of Nova when we had a 40th reunion recently, I said, I got a better education working on this program than if I'd gone to Harvard, Stanford, and MIT together.
Wow, yeah.
And he agreed with me.
Oh, yeah, that's incredible.
Yes.
Without having to pay
Without
ridiculous
having to pay.
tuition.
When I was in the 9th grade at my boarding school, an old graduate came back to give a talk. White-haired old man. What was his name? Buckminster Fuller.
Oh, fun.
And he gave this talk where he was just lost in concentration, like sort of a combination of a mad scientist and a 3-year-old in one person, right? Just this wonderful sense of wonder, but also focus.
Yeah.
So at one level there's the little child, but at another level there's a really expansive mind.
Yes.
And it's a magic combination, and you can see why these people have discovered as much as they did with it.
And I think, you know, the very little that I've read or heard from scientists, you know, which is mainly podcasts and things like that, but there is that sense of wonder. You know,
Yes.
so many of them talk about that, and I think that that also kind of brings us to the job that you had was behind the scenes.
That's right.
You know,
and
so you were...
My job was a lowly job, and this is the great thing about it is because my jobs were jobs that you learned them by rote, where you had to be absolutely reliable, so you had to do it by rote, okay? You had to be able to do it virtually in your sleep, flawlessly. But that meant that the rest of your mind didn't have to be paying attention in order to do your job, so you could pay attention to what the people were saying.
Yeah.
And so it gave me the ability to absorb so much, whereas if I'd been doing something that really took more of my mental focus to do the job, I couldn't have
That's
done
right,
that.
yeah. So you could just be a sponge.
This could be a total sponge.
A sponge who's been to the Olympics and met Nobel Prize winners.
All these great things. You know.
I know you've got a million of these
Yes,
stories, Roger.
indeed.
And have you ever thought about writing about them?
No, because I haven't. Yeah. I don't want to be doing some kind of tabloid tattling. I mean, I'm happy to sort of, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's so many. Well, we'll just have you on several times, and
There
you
we
can
go.
do
I can
installments.
do more installments. I always wanted, in the back of my mind, if I could, to move up here. And so in my mid-20s, I sort of formulated that as a goal, and by my early to mid-30s, I was actually able to bring that into being. Because if you're freelance and you have a good reputation, you don't have to be in a big city in order for people, because people will call you. And so one of the people I worked with down in Boston at some point later was working for Ken Burns, and Ken was saying, well, gee, I'm looking for an assistant, camera person, and this other person that I knew, that I'd worked for, recommended my name to Ken. So I started working with Ken in 1990 on baseball, and that was it. Then for the next 14 years, I was just working for them a lot. Jazz, Susan B. Anthony, Mark Twain, Lewis and Clark, a bit of the national parks, so many, many films, lots of traveling, really interesting stuff. And so that's how it works in that business, you know. So
in all of your travels and in all of your filming and being able to have that as sort of your anchor as you're traveling, you know, I think that what's very fascinating to me is this position that you've got of being able to observe these things and then to sort of take it in and digest it and then do some writing about it or simply educate yourself. I guess the question I'm asking really is about your inner and your outer world coming together.
Well, working on so many science shows as I did, I really came to appreciate the scientific methodology. And something else that I'd gotten very interested in because I was thrifty and saving my money was finance. And that the key in science is you let the data tell you what is going on. You don't try to push your opinion or imagination onto it. You can test hypotheses and things, but the key thing is that the data wins, not you, right? And so science practices humility, a mechanical humility, by subordinating itself to the data, okay? So the scientific methodology practices the humility that religions often talk about, but as soon as they describe themselves as a belief system, they can't be humble anymore.
No.
And so science ends up being humbler than religion.
Yeah.
And the key, though, is that humility, because that's what keeps you truthful. And by being truthful, you're being in alignment with what is there. And that's the essence, and that's that spiritual spot. And so the humility, and it doesn't have to be humility as virtue.
Right.
It only has to be that you're subordinated to the data, and that applies to finance. If you're talking about investing and that kind of thing, you want to be not going with what you think is true or what you believe. No, your own beliefs are your worst enemies. You want to be subordinate to what is truthful, because that puts you in alignment with all the facts. And so now the facts are on your side because you're on the facts side. And most people try to persuade the facts to be on their side. That doesn't work. You've got to look at what the facts are, align yourself with the facts, and now the facts are your friends. And you want to be effective in this world? Have the facts be your friends. But the only way you're going to have the facts be your friends is let the facts tell you what you should be thinking. Don't be trying to tell the facts what they should be. And so it circles back that science and spiritual awareness and good scholarship are all the same. And it's getting rid of self. Don't get up there. Don't let yourself get in there. And your opinions are your own worst enemies. We think we have opinions. But it's just as true that opinions have us. I was so fortunate to experience that spiritual perspective spontaneously when I was 17.
Yes.
And it's that same thing. It shows up in science, it shows up in math, it shows up in finance, it shows up in place after place. You
had such a wide range of experience, and to see that thread going through from the time you were 17.
I know.
And also at that age, in 1968, there were very few of us that weren't involved in some kind of an organization, religion, belief system, or school that was feeding us all kinds of information and to which we connected. But for you to go out on your own, that was your way. I mean, you were informed by something larger.
I was informed by something larger.
Yes.
I hadn't sought this. A minister I know put it so well. You don't find spiritual awareness. Spiritual awareness finds you. And I was lucky to have that happen, as was he. I think for a lot of people, they may not consciously have that happening to them. They may have experienced it but not realized it. And
or tried to subvert it in some way or manage it.
Right, and where organized religion goes awry is they think it's presented as a belief system, but as soon as you do that, it's what you do believe in versus what you don't believe in. Suddenly now you've got what amounts to an opinion or an ideology or a theology, which you're then going to defend instead of being humble enough, open enough to let the facts just be what they are and you align with them.
And to be generous enough to share them and smart enough to not define them in a way that limits them.
Exactly. You let them define you.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Yes.
This kind of segues into your book a little bit, I think.
Well, yeah, okay. So I'm writing a book right now about the environment and our economy, and it's looking at it through the math of gambling. So
And give us the title.
It's called Pushing Our Luck. And the beauty of math and the math of gambling is it's present everywhere, in everything you or anyone does. And so as a way of looking at things in a universal fashion, math fits it, the math of probabilities fits it. Everything you ever did was a bet of some form. And so that's really where it comes from, rather than trying to look at it scientifically, because the math of gambling looks in a rigorous way at situations where you don't have enough information. And that's just where we are. And so it allows a rigorous look at a situation with lots of unknowns.
That's right.
Yeah.
And again, it's something bigger. Happenstance, right? Fortune is bigger than us.
Yeah.
But you're also talking about being informed enough to be able to keep a certain amount of humility and to have enough intelligence to not get snookered.
I hope so.
Although there are a lot of people out there getting snookered.
Well,
every
it's
day.
easy to get snookered.
Yeah.
It's very easy to get snookered. It's very easy to think we're seeing what we expect to see.
Yeah.
And especially when you're going into novel areas, which is what we are doing, where we don't know what the dangers are yet, okay? Because we haven't done this long enough. But if we're coming from an expectation that things are going to go well and nothing bad has happened yet, the longer it goes on where nothing bad has happened, the more reinforced our thinking is going to be that this is safe. Whereas if something dangerous really is waiting to happen, we're actually getting closer to the danger that our thinking is telling us is ever less likely. You see, so it's kind of like a cigarette smoker in 1940 who didn't yet know that cigarettes were dangerous.
Yeah.
They'd smoked for 20 years already, not had any problems. Smoke another 2 years, 22 years, looks like it's safer and safer. We know today it's getting ever more dangerous for them, but they could delude themselves into thinking it was getting ever safer. And the problem is our whole civilization making that exact same kind of error on a planet that's finite in size, where if we lose this particular bet, because we're so big on it now, there's no offsetting victories happening elsewhere. As long as you can spread your risk, you can get away with being wrong a lot, but if you're betting at such large scale, you can't spread your risk. Even if the odds don't change, the penalty of losing is so much higher because there's no victories happening elsewhere at the same time.
Right. And so at this point, you could probably say a word about success and failure, I think.
Well, success,
that's sort of,
if you want to have success, guess what? You got to have failure, because it doesn't mean anything. Success doesn't mean anything without failure. So life and existence is always going to be the both of them, okay? And success and failure, unless they're completely random, if you can spread your risk enough, are going to create a pattern which can then inform you about where the dangers are so that you can learn from your mistakes. So as long as your mistakes are small enough, they actually enrich your knowledge, and you can afford the mistake because it's actually going to improve your subsequent aim. So mistakes can be your friend if you can make them small.
Right.
But the same mistakes, if you can't spread your risk, now can become fatal. But if you don't realize that the stakes have gone way up because you've been emboldened by winning and growing and winning and growing and winning and growing, nothing will tell you that you're suddenly playing a very dangerous gambling game until the very end, when it all goes badly. And the question is that what our species is doing on this planet?
Right, right. And so, meanwhile, back at the ranch, you're out there bushwhacking some trails for us, right?
Yeah,
and you get to
absolutely.
chop some wood,
Yes.
and you get to breathe the fresh air,
Yes.
and you get to stay sane.
Well, mostly. You should ask my friends how sane I am.
Thank the Lord, though, that you've got a balance going on.
Yes.
Well, we look forward to seeing your book whatever shape it's in.
Okay.
And, it'd be great to do maybe some readings locally, too.
Oh,
That
yes.
might be a very fun thing for people to hear, I'm sure. Anyway, it's been a pleasure, Roger.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
All right, you're welcome.
Great. It was fun, as well, as always. Thanks.
Okay.
And thanks to all of you for coming to join us again today. We have many more people who are lined up to come on the show, and keep an eye on Roger, and he does still do nature walks. You are still doing trailblazing walks. They're always fun, they're always informative. Keep your eye out for Roger's book, which will be published, called Pushing Our Luck, and we will let you know all about that too. Tune in next time. Thank you so much for being with us.